There's PowerPoint. Okay. It's like, where is the PowerPoint? It is shown up now. I always start the camera before I'm ready. So welcome to gender. This is the next topic, the last topic in inequalities module. And we will briefly get through these. So if you are interested in gender from the theoretical perspectives, functionalism is going to be focusing on a two-gender system. And how can we divide up the responsibilities in society if we conveniently have two types of people? People type 1, people type 2, and then why don't we divide up everything between these two groups? So functionalism looks at it that way. Conflict theory is going to look at power, and we got the thing pop up in the middle here. Conflict theory will look at power. Symbolic interactionism is going to look at treating people in different ways. How would we actually have the communications? How do you interact with students in a classroom? Do you interact with male students different than female students? Do female professors interact different than male professors? And on. So symbolic interactionism. So the first definitions we need to look at are sex and gender. So sex is the biology part, the biological distinction between male and female. Here are some different odds and ends of X's and XY's and mutations. Biological determination is that idea that behavioral differences are because of the inherited physical conditions. You do female things because biologically you're female. You do male things because biologically you're male. And can never be otherwise, basically. So we're going to kind of attack that notion in just a little bit and see, can you have ruthless, cannibalistic females? You wouldn't necessarily think about that. Can you have very gentle, clothing-loving, fashionable, nurturing males? What is that? Where do we draw those lines between biology and gender? And this is the topic where we are most tied to biology, where you cannot escape your chromosomes, but you can try to overcome, right, from time to time. So when we're looking at the sex characteristics, primary sex characteristics are the genitalia. So this is what you're looking at when your child is born and they hold them up and you're like, this is a boy or this is a girl. The secondary sex characteristics are the ones that we can see in public, basically. You look at somebody and we're not supposed to be seeing genitalia in public, so that's not going to give us any clues. We have to look at other things like wider hips and breasts. We have to look at taller, heavier muscles, body hair, voice tone, the clothing, and we can't put clothing on here yet, but oftentimes we will dress ourselves and comport ourselves in ways that signal to people what sex we are, female or male. Intersex is a combination of female and male, internal and external genitalia. Some more differences. Males on average are 150 pounds, females a little bit smaller. Males tend to have more upper body strength, but females can develop this. We're about to watch the gymnasts this week in the Olympics, and those women are strong. They could lift cars off of people probably if they needed to. So incredible upper body strength in order to do these gymnastic skills. And they have to work very hard to develop that because it doesn't come easily with their biology. Males will outperform women in short tests of endurance. Females will outperform in long tests. Males tend to have greater math and spatial ability. Females tend to have greater verbal and nonverbal skills. But there is some argument that maybe these are learned. These last two, are men better at spatial skills than females because we let them go out of their houses? They were the hunters. They would go out on ships and navigate. They were allowed more opportunities to develop these things. Females learn nonverbal skills pretty quickly, especially if you're caring for young children who can't talk to you for a couple years. You have to figure out what they're saying. And again, with nonverbal skills, if you are not the dominant group and you are a female in a society where you're not the dominant group, you've got to be watchful. There's this always ever watchfulness, watching for nonverbal cues of the people that you're running into in the street. If you are walking by yourself as a female, going through the mall or something like that, there's always a part of your brain kind of scanning for nonverbal cues. Is this the person who's going to kidnap me and haul me off in a car and do bad things? We have to be always conscious of danger. One thing that I would ask my students when we were in a classroom is, night classes. What do you do when you walk to the car? And the males are like, what do you mean? What do you do when you walk to the car? I leave the building, I walk to the car. And the girls are like, I put the keys between my fingers, and we prepare to walk outside, to walk to our cars. So there are differences in these perceptions between males and females and the real experiences between them. This is a chart I made up for one of my classes as we were trying to figure out what are the new gender systems today. So if you look at biological sex and gender, biological sex, you do have more than two categories. Male, female, that's a male, female, intersex are your general three, but you have other odds and ends of mutations. And traditionally, we have been a two-bucket system. Regardless of where you are here, you must fall into the male or female bucket, and there is no other bucket for you. But in the last 10 years or so, we are developing other buckets. And these buckets that we are developing in our culture, cisgender male, cisgender female, the cisgender part is just like, I'm cisgender female. I have always been female. I'm biologically female. I have always presented myself as female. I feel like a female. I have born children like a female. I have never felt any kind of conflict with the gender that I feel that I occupy, the gender status that I feel that I occupy, and the biological body that I have. Transgender male and transgender female would be a transgender male would be biologically female, yet would desire to occupy a male gender status. Transgender female would be a male body biologically, but wanting to occupy a female gender status. And then gender fluid is either male or female, and generally would like to decide on a day or a week or a month which gender status they would wish to occupy, or just to occupy neither one. They just want to occupy human status. And gender fluid and transgender are not the same as intersex. Intersex is its own category that we have traditionally made pick either male or female, and now we have a tendency to force the intersex into gender fluid or into transgender. So there's still mismatches, but it's not quite what it was. So gender is a status. We occupy the status. Whatever genders are available in your culture are the genders that you could potentially occupy. Now that we have expanded genders and the concept of gender, you have up to 5 you can physically occupy, but traditionally it has been 2. So the expectations and behaviors associated with a sex category within a society acquired through socialization. The gender identity is this awareness of being masculine or feminine. So gender is the social concept. And that's where it gets a little bit tricky, right? That's where you have such a tie to biology in this topic than you do in any other topic, because you have the body that you have the chromosomes that you have the physical manifestation of those chromosomes, but you also have status, which is an entirely different concept. So in sociology, we have to think of them as very, very different things. You have the biological manifestation of the chromosomes, and then you have whatever gender statuses are available in your society, and then regardless of the physical manifestations of your chromosomes, you can occupy any of the statuses and have that gender identity of those statuses. So gender identity, this is the chart that the girls always get mad at, but this is reinforced every handful of years by social psychology professors. And this is more an idea of, say, Disney princess style, but it's more, if you are going to be writing a children's show or some sort of movie and you needed to have a feminine character and you needed to have a masculine character, what would these look like? And this is the lists that we tend to get. Women are emotional, receptive, intuitive, weak, timid, content, passive, all that. masculine traits, dominant, independent, competent, rational, assertive, analytical, strong, brave, ambitious, those things. But in the reality is we're all kind of fluid in the middle, right? There's no way I could have gone to graduate school if I had only observed feminine traits every single day of my entire life. I only did this. No way. You have to be independent. I mean, the females listening to this, if you're not here, you would not be here if you only inhabited these traits. There's some borrowing up of the lower groups. So if we say masculine is dominant, feminine is the subordinate groups can borrow up. So we can borrow some independence, we can borrow some competence, we can borrow some assertiveness, we can borrow some brave and strong and ambitiousness and competitiveness. Now, we might get bad looks and we might get called bad names and all of that stuff, but we can. But can men borrow backwards? Can men then, the dominant group over here, go backwards and be receptive and passive and content and cooperative and sensitive? Not in this society, right? So when we're looking at these gender identity, we have to look at what are the expectations? What are the cultural expectations? What do we actually do? And then how does that all balance out when we're looking at power in our society? So one of our earlier theorists, anthropologist Margaret Mead, went to New Guinea and looked at 3 different tribes. She looked at the Arapesh, Mondugamor, the Chambuli, and she kind of roughly categorized these based on the male and female gender stereotypes of her time. So think late 30s into the 1940s, maybe some early 50s. So she's in that time period. So she goes to the Arapesh and she watches them and she studies them and she writes about them and says that the males and females both are cooperative, unaggressive, empathetic. She has beautiful pictures of the mothers of the Arapesh tribe breastfeeding their children, rubbing their little heads, playing with their little feet. Sometimes dad will come over and play with their little feet while they're breastfeeding. Just as cooperative, unaggressive, empathetic, or as she described it, both genders displayed female characteristics, traditionally female characteristics. Mondugamor is like Sparta revived. The males and females were aggressive, ruthless, unresponsive to the needs of others. She tells stories of the Mondugamor tribes breastfeeding their children, where the moms are basically holding the baby by the back of their heads and shoving up against the food source. And then as soon as the kid is done eating, all but dropped on the ground because I am done with you now. You have had substance, and that is my only responsibility to you. So very, very, very different styles of upbringing, very Spartan. So Margaret Mead is saying they act as though both males and females are traditionally masculine in our society. And Shambuli, she looks as opposite. The women were the dominant, impersonal, aggressive, rational leaders of the tribe. The men were beautiful. They spent a lot of time getting dressed and painting their faces and putting on the feathered skirts and everything that they wore. They took care of, I mean, they obviously can't breastfeed infants, but they can take care of children otherwise, take care of the elderly. They were the caregivers and, I'd say, trophy wives, but not exactly the way that we would consider trophy wives, but they were objects of beauty, dependent and submissive. So in a Chambuli tribe, it would be like the opposite. The women would be male and the men would be female, according to our ideas. A few other things we look at is gender and sexuality. We've looked at transsexual, transgender already. Sexual orientation, your preference in terms of sexual partners. And this is the interesting trichotomy, the sexual identity. How do you publicly identify? Who are you attracted to? And then what is your behavior? It's not always going to go into a nice circle like this. There are 3 elements. How do you self-identify or publicly identify? Who is your attraction? And then the behavior. And we look here. This is an older chart, but it's still pretty close. Men, 81.4. self-identify as heterosexual, 11.3 homosexual. Females more heterosexual, homosexual, more bisexual than men. But this became, that whole triangle thing became really important with HIV, right? Because HIV in the United States started out as a gay man's disease. So the idea was, okay, it's them. We don't have to worry about this, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, because it's them. But they don't just have sex with each other, right? Just because they are identified as a homosexual does not mean that they are only having homosexual sex, or people that are identified as heterosexual aren't just having heterosexual sex. So you have the straight identified men who are having sex with women, gay identified men having sex with women, bisexual men having sex with women, and then straight gay bisexual with men, and then straight gay bisexual with both men and women. So it goes out of the population very quickly. Yes, some of that was sharing needles and drug use, but not all of it. And that's where we started trying to collect numbers and say, the numbers aren't huge. Bisexual identified men who have sex with women, 15. Straight men, gay men who have sex with women. It's more straight men who have sex with men bring HIV back into the larger community. And that's where some of the issues were in the early days of HIV. So that's where we started to really start studying that triangle, the identity, behavior, attraction kind of thing. Now, here are sexual orientation laws in the world. Now we have to look at this as a status. If you are homosexual, bisexual, pansexual, homosexual, heterosexual, whatever they are, the various different off the top of my head, like a Punnett square, who's attracted to who according to the original gender. But it's a status. I'm heterosexual, have 4 children. I occupy the heterosexual status. I have former students and friends who are homosexual. They occupy the status of homosexual, either homosexual male, homosexual female, but the status exists. So when you're looking at these green areas, they have the status of homosexuality and people occupy that status. Now, if you're looking at the red countries, this is death penalty. So it doesn't mean that you have 0 homosexual orientation. You have 0 attraction between men and men or females and females. You have 0 homosexual identity. You probably have very little homosexual behavior, but it doesn't mean that you don't have identity and attractiveness. But there's no status, because as soon as you enter that status, it's a death penalty. Why would you enter that status? So we have to look at this as both behavioral and culture at the same time. Do you have a status that you can recognizably enter and still live your everyday life in this society, or do you not have that status available to you? So we look globally where that status is not available. Doesn't mean that homosexuality is not in existence. It just means that status is unavailable for the most part. All right, so the sex talk, 30 seconds, you guys are grown-ups. So I like to split it up into contraception, consent, and contagion. So contraception, we are pretty comfortable with. We should know what those are. We don't have Planned Parenthood anymore. Best place ever to get contraception information, but there is a campus clinic that you can get information from there. Consent, we will look at that too. Contagion is what we're starting out with, though, the sexual exposure chart. This is the exponential nature of exposures. This is fairly recent state of STDs in the United States. So, and some increases. You see syphilis, look at that. 71% rate increase of infectious syphilis since 2014. So definitely an increase in syphilis. And again, you don't want to put, like in sociology, you don't want to put judgments upon people. These are germs. Germs want to live. And if a germ can be sexually transmitted, they got it made, right? Because people are going to do things that are going to transmit them from one to another and keep them alive. So it is in the best interests of the germs to become sexually transmittable. Airborne is pretty awesome too, as we're seeing with COVID, but sexually transmittable is a pretty good gig if you're a germ. So 1.8 million cases of chlamydia, 19% increase, gonorrhea, 63% increase, 71% increase of syphilis, and 185% increase in syphilis among newborns. So get that checked. Syphilis often has 0 symptoms, especially in men. So it is definitely worth getting these things tested to make sure that you are not spreading them. You will go ahead and just get rid of them and knock them out. Don't give them the opportunity to spread. So here's another one. This is kind of your odds. And this is, again, germs want to live, right? So syphilis has almost a 50% per sexual act, right? If you have syphilis and you have sex with somebody unprotected, and one of you is positive and one of you isn't, it's a 50-50 chance that you're going to give that other person syphilis. So HPV, little low, human papillomavirus, gonorrhea, 2 women is really, really high. Chlamydia is not really all that high. HSV is humans, herpes simplex virus 2, right? HIV, mycoplasma is another nice bacterial infection. So these are all the risks of transmission, basically. And again, germs want to live. That's the entire argument here. We don't want to put judgment onto people have STDs or don't have STDs. Get tested, because that's a good gig for germs to have. The last thing to talk about really briefly, here's the Alabama ones. We got to do that first. So this is old, but yeah, Alabama. Watch out for that. We're going to skip through some of these. You're not going to go to that website. All right. And go there. All right. So consent, the very last topic, just have a really brief discussion of that. And that's the idea of boundaries. What does consent really mean? And our media does not do a particularly good job displaying consent. A lot of our shows have men kind of being stalky and chasing down women who kind of say no to begin with and eventually give in and everybody lives happily ever after. But that's not real consent, right? Real consent is full consent, and males I encourage to watch for full consent. Get real verbal consent with each step as you're taking the step in intimacy. Make sure that everybody's on the same page. Now, you don't need to invite a notary public on the date with you to record consent, but you want to have clear verbal consent. You don't want a grunt or anything like that that you might be misinterpreting, or silence that you might be misinterpreting. You want real verbal consent. And then I encourage the females to give that real verbal consent. Own your sexuality in these encounters. And if you are consenting, consent. And if you are not consenting, don't consent. And then males have to be watching for that. As soon as the first person says no, it's over. That's what I taught my children. I have 2 older kids that are out in the world doing things. And that's the lesson that I taught them from the beginning. I wouldn't let them tickle each other. If you start tickling somebody and somebody says no, it stops immediately. If you're wrestling in the household and you're throwing stuff at people, or you're playing around or whatever, sitting next to somebody on the couch and leaning against them, being an annoying sibling, as soon as that other sibling says stop it, you stop. You're done. The first person who says no, when it's over. So you can teach consent there, and then it builds into the idea of sexuality, to consent in that environment as well. So females, make sure you are consenting, and males, watch for that clear consent. And ask if you are unclear, if you're not entirely sure that they are comfortable, either of you. If you are unclear as to whether somebody is comfortable in whatever activities are going on, stop and ask, are you okay with this? Should we be continuing? It's a dialogue between the people involved, and the dialogue should be happening. So that's my little bit of moralizing as a parent of children. And that's it for gender. So